Guns. They're an integral fighting mechanic in thousands of video games. Some games, such as Escape from Tarkov, use extremely realistic firearm models and names. Other games like Halo and Gears of War are sci-fi shooters with fictional weapons. Yet there is a third class of video games that fall between real and entirely made up. One example are games that use mostly realistic weapons with fake names, such as Call of Duty Modern Warfare, where we can identify a weapon that is essentially a Chris Vector, however it's labeled as a Fennec. Another example are games that started out using real guns and eventually shifted to using hodgepodge creations that blend features from various guns into a single piece. A famous example of this is the Metal Gear Solid series, where in the beginning the characters used guns like the iconic HK Mark 23, and most recently, in Metal Gear Solid 5, shifted to using franking guns, like the Mach 37, that looks like a mashup between an MP5 and a Walther MPL. To get to my point and the topic of this video, my question is, why does this third class of games exist? Is there a reason that certain games refuse to use real guns, or why games that previously used real guns eventually switched over? If you're like me, you're probably listening to this and saying to yourself, well, it's to avoid legal troubles. While you may be right, the answer probably isn't as cut and dry as that. Let's speculate. 1. Avoiding trademarks. So this would probably be the most obvious, right? All these gun companies have logos, names, and designs that are either copyrighted or trademarked. To avoid lawsuits and paying exorbitant fees for the use of their products in-game, game developers simply skirt around using the real deal. But that doesn't really explain why some games developed by smaller companies, such as Ready or Not, can use a plethora of real guns without going bankrupt from the amount of royalties they'd have to fork over. As it turns out, prior to 2013, most game companies did reach out to license firearms for their games in some form or another. However, these deals usually did not involve a lot of money and could be seen as product placement, where gun manufacturers allowed the use of their products so long as they weren't portrayed in an intentionally negative or false manner. That all changed in 2013 when Electronic Arts publicly stated that they would no longer be licensing guns for use in their games, such as Medal of Honor. It was a ballsy move, no doubt. So what led to them making such a bold decision? Well, in the 2011 ruling, Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Association, the Supreme Court did away with a California law that banned stores from selling violent games to minors unless there was an adult present. This ruling essentially gave video games the same legal privileges as movies, TV, and books. These forms of media generally do not require licensing to depict products. Frank Gibbo, EA's president of labels at the time, said in a 2013 interview that a book doesn't pay for saying the word Colt. And most game companies have followed suit since then. But if these companies have a First Amendment right to depict these guns in their video games, why are they still not committing? Number 2. Maintaining neutrality. When not avoiding literal court, game companies are avoiding the court of public opinion. Guns and video games are both unfortunately tied to shootings. Guns more so than games nowadays, but there will always be some politician drawing a harebrained connection between the two. We've seen firearm companies like Daniel Defense come under fire in recent years because certain terrible individuals arbitrarily chose their rifles. If a game company were to depict real firearms and names in their games, especially if the hero character uses it, one could potentially argue that the company endorses that product and the gun industry as a whole. And of course, the majority of people play video games these days, so it's only a small jump for a lawyer to connect an ill-intentioned person back to a game. Ridiculous as that may sound, we live in pretty ridiculous times. Keep in mind, this is not me trying to start an argument. I'm just suggesting that these companies might be trying to cover their bases, especially larger companies like EA and Activision that are easier targets for lawsuits like this. It might explain why some smaller games don't shy away from using the real thing as much. Another interesting thing to take into consideration is the rising popularity of realistic tactical shooters within the last few years. The number of games that are starting to use real guns again is increasing, so the demand for realism might outweigh the potential negative drawbacks for some of these companies. It will be interesting to see how this develops in the coming years. 3. Creative liberties. Sometimes there are no legal threats looming over a game developer, and they simply choose to make their own versions of the guns to allow for customization. The widely accepted reason for Metal Gear Solid 5 taking a complete turn away from real guns is to allow for extensive modification of the firearms in-game. A lot of us are familiar with the Resident Evil franchise and its tendency to have unique versions of real guns, specifically the customized variant of the Beretta 92 called the Samurai Edge. However, things changed a little when Resident Evil 4 was released. Although this game is full of realistic guns, the iconic main handgun of protagonist Leon isn't entirely based on an existing model. The first build of Resident Evil 4, dubbed the Hookman version by fans, sees Leon using a Sig Sauer P226. During the original development of RE4 as we know it, he was using a Ruger KP94. However, for some reason, they switched it to a different pistol for the final game. This gun, known by most as the Silver Ghost, is said to be inspired by the HK USP, Smith & Wesson Sigma, and Ruger P85 by Capcom designer Ryomura Gyoshin. Although there is no official story or lore surrounding why the Silver Ghost came about, there was an article released in 2006 in ARMS magazine that essentially made it sound as if the gun was meant to be a one-of-a-kind creation for Leon. So in this instance, it might just be a case of the devs thought it would be cool. Interestingly though, the remake of Resident Evil 4 is right around the corner, and Leon is not using the Silver Ghost he was equipped with in the original, but an actual customized HK USP. Perhaps this is a result of that demand for realism I mentioned a few minutes ago. Who knows? Final thoughts and what we've learned. Different game companies have different priorities. There are currently no legal obligations to seek out licensing to feature real guns and names for use in a video game. However, it seems like many companies tend to play it safe and keep at least the names ambiguous. That doesn't mean there are always legal motivations behind these decisions, as sometimes it's just simply the vision of the developers to have made-up firearms. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something because I certainly did in making this video. Leave a like for a poor soul or check out the rest of my channel if you're into guns and games. Until next time.